She was standing in the produce aisle of a grocery store at the edge of the world, and for 3 full seconds I forgot how to breathe. 8 months. 8 months of nothing, no call, no note, nothing but the ring on the counter and the particular silence of a woman who had decided, completely and finally, that I was something to survive. And here she was, in a town I had only found because a name appeared in an insurance filing that crossed my desk by accident, holding a bunch of carrots, like a person who had built a whole quiet life in the space where I used to be. She hadn't seen me yet. That was the last moment I had any advantage, and I stood there and wasted it entirely. Before we continue, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single one. And if this story pulled you in, a like and a subscribe means more than you know. It's what lets me keep writing and keep creating. Thank you. Truly. Now, let's get back to it. 7:14 in the evening, 41 degrees. The grocery store at the south end of Heron Cove was the kind of place that still used handwritten price tags and smelled like coffee grounds and the sea. I watched her move to the next aisle before I followed. Not close. Close enough. She was thinner than I remembered, or maybe just different, the kind of different that happens when someone stops performing and starts simply existing. Her hair was shorter. She wore a coat I didn't recognize. Everything about her said new life, new name, new rules, and I almost respected it enough to leave. Almost. She turned before I reached her. Not startled. Nora never startled. She went very still instead, the way a person goes still when they've already run the calculations and don't love the answer. "Marcus," she said. Not a greeting, a diagnosis. "You look well," I said, because I was raised to be civil even when civility is a form of violence. She didn't answer. Her eyes went briefly to the left, not to the exit, I noted. To the far end of the aisle, where the children's section of the store bled into the main floor. A small geography of instinct. I filed it. "How did you find me?" she said. Still not a question. She already knew I wouldn't have come here on a guess. "Insurance filing. Your name came up adjacent to a property claim. I wasn't looking." I paused. "I want you to know that. I wasn't looking." She studied me the way she always had, like she was reading something written in a language she'd taught herself in secret. Then she said quietly, "You should go." What I thought was, I know, what I said was nothing at all. And in the silence between us, something moved at the end of the aisle. Small, quick, a child. Maybe 3 years old, toddling toward her with the absolute confidence of someone who has never once doubted their welcome. Nora caught her without looking. Pure instinct. One arm down, one child scooped, one body between that child and me before I'd even processed what I was seeing. The little girl had her mother's eyes, and she had something else entirely. Something that landed in my chest like a key finding a lock I didn't know was there. Nora was watching me now. Not afraid. Past afraid. She was watching me the way you watch a man standing at the edge of something irreversible. "Marcus," she said again. Different this time. Everything different. The fog pressed against the windows. The store hummed its fluorescent indifference. The child looked at me with those familiar eyes and said nothing, and somehow that was the loudest thing in the room. 7:41 in the evening. Still 41 degrees. The parking lot of the store was empty except for a rusted blue sedan and my rental, separated by 12 feet of cracked asphalt that felt, at that moment, like an uncrossable distance. She came out 10 minutes after I did. I hadn't left. She'd known I wouldn't. The child was on her hip, face tucked against her mother's neck, already drowsy. Nora stopped 3 feet from me and shifted her weight slightly, not defensive, resigned. The posture of someone who had known, somewhere under everything, that this moment was always coming. "Her name is Ellie," she said, before I could ask. An offering. The smallest one she could make. I looked at the child. Dark hair, her mother's jaw, and something in the set of the eyes, a particular quality of watchfulness, that I had seen once before, in a photograph my mother kept on the mantel. Me, at age 4, at the ocean, looking at the water like I was already trying to understand it. I didn't say what I was thinking. I wasn't ready to say it, and she wasn't ready to hear it, and maybe the parking lot of a grocery store in a dying coastal town wasn't the place anyway. "She's 7 months old," I said, quietly. Not a question. Nora said nothing. "You left in March." A pause. "You were already." Yes, the word like a stone dropped into still water. I turned away from them both. Not from anger. I was too far past anger into something slower and harder to name. I turned because I needed 3 seconds where no one was watching my face. The fog had come in completely off the water. The streetlight above us barely made it to the ground. When I turned back, she was still there. That surprised me a little. "You are going to do this alone," I said. "I have done it alone." "That's not what I asked." She adjusted Ellie against her shoulder and looked at me with an expression I couldn't read. That was new. There was a time I could read everything she was. She had taught herself to close. "You should find somewhere to stay," she said finally. "If you're going to insist on being here, the inn on the North Road. It's closed for the season." "I know, I spoke to the owner." I looked at her steadily. She made an exception. Something moved behind her eyes. The understanding that I had already arranged things. That I was, as I had always been, 3 moves ahead in every game except the ones that mattered. "One conversation," she said. "Tomorrow. That's all I'm agreeing to." I nodded. She walked to her car. I watched her buckle Ellie into the back seat with the careful, practiced tenderness of someone who has been doing this alone in the dark for months, and my chest did something I didn't have a name for. I drove to the inn in the fog. I didn't sleep. 9:12 in the morning, 44 degrees. The only cafe in Heron Cove occupied the ground floor of a building that had been, at various points in its history, a bait shop and a post office. It smelled like both. She arrived 4 minutes late. Nora was never late. I understood immediately that the 4 minutes were a small act of self-preservation, a way of walking in while I was already there, already seated, already something she was approaching rather than something she was waiting for. She ordered coffee, black, said nothing to the woman behind the counter about knowing me. I noted that. She sat across from me and wrapped both hands around her cup and said, "Ask." So I asked, "Why?" Not "Why did you leave?" She knew that wasn't what I meant. Why the ring on the counter without a word? Why 8 months of nothing? Why, when she knew, she must have known, she was carrying something that changed the entire calculation. She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the fog was lifting off the water slowly, like a stage curtain someone had decided, at the last moment, not to pull. "Because you would have stayed," she said. I waited. "You would have stayed, and you would have been good. You're always good, Marcus. That's never been the problem, and I would have watched you build a life around something you didn't choose, and eventually," she stopped, started again. "I know how that ends. I watched my mother live that story. You don't know how it ends for me. I know how it ends for me." There it was. Not about my choices, about her certainty regarding her own destruction. That particular flavor of damage, the kind that disguises itself as intelligence. I looked at my coffee. I looked at her hands around her cup, the knuckles slightly white. I looked at the door to the cafe, which she had positioned herself nearest to. Old habit, old wound. "Ellie," I said. Her hands tightened. "I want to know her." I kept my voice level. "I'm not asking for anything you aren't willing to give. I'm not making demands or threats. I'm telling you something true. I want to know my daughter." The words sat between us on the table. Daughter. First time either of us had said it aloud. Nora's face did something complicated and brief and then smoothed back to nothing. "I know," she said, very quietly. "Then we have to figure out what comes next." She looked at me then, really looked, the way she used to before she learned to stop, and for one unguarded second I saw the thing she'd been carrying for 8 months. Not guilt, not defiance, something rawer than both. The cafe door opened, a cold gust off the water moved through the room. Neither of us looked away. 2:17 in the afternoon. 42 degrees and dropping. She'd agreed to a walk. Not with me, past me, alongside me, the way 2 people share a path without conceding anything about the destination. The beach in November was a different country than the beach in summer. Gray and reduced and honest. The tourists were gone. What remained was just the water doing what water does, indifferent to audience. Ellie walked between us, that new, effortful toddler walk, high-kneed, arms out for balance, stopping every few feet to investigate a shell or a piece of rack grass with the absolute seriousness of a field researcher. Nora watched her constantly, the particular vigilance of someone who has never once been able to afford inattention. I watched them both. "She started walking at 11 months, Nora said, not looking at me. "Early. Her pediatrician said so." A pause. "She's healthy. She's always been healthy." She said it like she was answering a question I hadn't asked, and I understood that she'd been preparing answers for a long time. I crouched down when Ellie brought me a shell, dark brown, the size of a thumbnail, unremarkable, and held it out to me with the expression of someone conferring an honor. I took it, turned it over, gave it back. She tucked it into her coat pocket with enormous satisfaction. When I stood, Nora was watching me with an expression I couldn't catalogue. I looked away first. "I'm not going back to London immediately," I said. I didn't think you were. I'm not trying to dismantle what you've built here. I meant it. The town, small and weather-worn as it was, had a kind of order to it. Her order. Things placed where she had put them. What are you trying to do, then? An honest question deserved an honest answer, and the honest answer was that I didn't entirely know. 8 months ago I would have said I was a man who had his life arranged precisely as he wanted it. I would have believed that. I don't know yet, I said. I'm trying to figure it out. She seemed to accept that in a way she wouldn't have accepted something more polished. Ellie had found a larger shell and was now carrying it in both hands with the focused gravity of someone transporting something precious. She made her way back to Nora and lifted it up. Nora took it, examined it, said, "That's a good one." And the child beamed that total, uncomplicated, devastating kind of joy that belongs only to very small people who have not yet learned that anything is complicated. I had to look at the water for a moment. "She has your stubbornness," Nora said quietly, and there was something in her voice that wasn't quite an apology and wasn't quite warmth and was something in the territory between the two. 6:58 in the evening, 37 degrees, she had, against what I suspected was her better judgment, invited me for dinner. The cottage was at the north end of town, set back from the road by a screen of beach grass and a garden that had been put to bed for the winter with the care of someone who intended to come back to it. Inside was small and deliberate, nothing wasted, books organized in a way that suggested they were actually read. A child's drawings fixed to the refrigerator with unmatched magnets, the smell of something with garlic and bay leaf on the stove. I stood in her kitchen, and it was one of the stranger experiences of my adult life to see so clearly the world someone built in your absence, and to understand that it was good, that she had been capable of good all along, that the question had always been whether she believed it. Ellie ate first, enthusiastically and with limited precision, and Nora cleaned her up with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made peace with entropy. Then Ellie was carried off to bed, and I heard Nora's voice through the wall, low, unhurried, a story about something involving a rabbit and a very stubborn turnip, and the cottage was quiet in a way that had texture to it. Nora came back and stood at the stove with her back to me. "You can ask," she said. "I know you're cataloging things. Occupational habit. You're not working right now." "I'm always working." I paused. "That was one of your objections." She stirred the pot. "Didn't confirm or deny. What are the others?" I asked. "The objections. I'd like to know them clearly if we're going to do this honestly." She was quiet for long enough that I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, "You don't let people in. You let them near. There's a distance you keep that's very expertly disguised as closeness, and I lived inside it for 2 years before I understood what I was feeling was loneliness." She set down the spoon. "And you never talked about your family. Not once. Not really." I absorbed that. "There are things," I said carefully, "that I haven't told you. I know. Not because I didn't trust you." I stopped. This was the edge of something. Because some things once said can't be managed afterward. I was protecting you from a reaction I couldn't predict. She turned then, looked at me directly, and I saw underneath the composure, underneath the 8 months of careful reconstruction, that she was still afraid of me. Not of what I might do, of what she might feel. "Marcus," her voice had gone quiet. "What are you not telling me?" The pot simmered. The wind came off the water outside. A child slept 12 feet away. I looked at her and said, "My name isn't Marcus Cole." 7:44 in the evening, 36 degrees. She didn't move. The pot went on simmering and the wind went on coming off the water, and Nora stood at the stove with her face doing something very still and very careful. "Then what is it?" she said at last. "Alexander Voss." I watched her. "Son of Dmitri Voss." The name landed. I saw it land. She knew the name, of course she did. Anyone who had spent any time in European finance knew the name Voss, the way you know the names of mountains that have caused avalanches, and now I watched her reassemble everything she thought she knew about the last 3 years of her life, refitting each piece into a new frame, and it was one of the more difficult things I had ever done, standing still while someone did that. "The consulting firm," she said. "Partially real. London, real. The firm provided useful distance from the family interests. Why Marcus Cole? My mother's maiden name, her choice. She had concerns about my father's business. She wanted one son who could walk away if necessary." Nora turned fully toward me now. "And have you walked away?" The answer was complicated in a way that a single word couldn't hold. "I've been trying to." She looked at me for a long time, the kind of look that is itself a form of honesty. Not performing anything, just reading. "Is Ellie in danger?" she said, flat and direct. "The only thing that actually mattered, not from my father. He doesn't know about her." I held her gaze. "I didn't know about her, and my father doesn't know I'm here." Does he know about me? A pause that was fractionally too long. He knew I was involved with someone, I said. Not your name, not where you were. When you left, I didn't pursue it, partly because you'd made it clear you wanted distance, and partly because drawing attention to you was the last thing I would do. She sat down at the kitchen table. Not collapse, Nora didn't collapse, but the careful, deliberate sitting of someone who needs a moment to be horizontal with the facts. I stayed where I was. I didn't approach. Some moments ask for stillness. The ring, I said quietly. It was my grandmother's, the one who stayed when everyone else built walls and called it strategy. She looked up at me. Leaving it, I said, was the right call. You had no way of knowing what it was. You were protecting yourself from something real. I didn't know how real, she said. No, I kept you from that. To protect me. Yes. She held my gaze. That's not how love works, Marcus. She stopped. Corrected herself deliberately. Alexander. The name in her mouth was a strange thing. My name, after years of not hearing it. In a cottage on a November coast, from the woman who had taken my daughter and run, who had been right to run, who was looking at me now without hatred, which was either grace or the beginning of something I hadn't earned yet. No, I said, it isn't. 9:23 in the evening. 34 degrees. The dinner had gone cold. Neither of us had eaten it. She made tea instead. Functional, not warm, something to do with her hands. I sat at the table and she sat across from it, and outside the fog had come back in off the water, thicker now, pressing at the windows. I told her. Not everything, there are volumes I will carry to my grave, but enough. My father's holdings, which were real and extensive and acquired through methods that required lawyers who understood the geography of legality. The expectation that I would return and take my place in the structure. The decade I'd spent building something of my own, the firm, the distance, the name, as a slow, careful refusal that had never quite become a clean break. She listened the way she always listened, without performing response, just receiving. The reason I never talked about family, I said, isn't because I was hiding from you. It was because talking about it is how it gets close to you. I'd spent years keeping a wall between those two worlds. You were on the right side of the wall. I was trying to keep it that way. By excluding me from half of who you are. Yes. She turned her teacup once. That's the thing I couldn't live in. Not the danger, or not only that, the management. A pause. Being cared for in a way that felt like administration. I sat with that. It was accurate in a way that wasn't comfortable. My father's name, she said then. You knew. I was still. When we met, at the Rotterdam conference, you knew who I was before I introduced myself. I always thought it was a coincidence, us ending up at the same table. She looked at me steadily. Was it? The moment in the story where everything underneath breaks the surface. No, I said. She nodded, slowly, like something she had suspected for a long time had finally stepped out of the shadows and introduced itself. Your father and mine had history. Yes, and you were. I was told to make contact, to establish a connection that my father could use as leverage. I held her gaze without flinching, because she deserved that much. I agreed. Because at 29 I was still operating inside my father's gravity, and because I hadn't yet understood the cost of it. She said nothing. I lasted 40 minutes, I said, at that table, before I understood that whatever I had agreed to, I was not going to do it. 40 minutes. You told me about the work you were doing in coastal erosion intervention. You were furious about something a ministerial committee had gotten wrong, and you didn't bother to soften it for the table. Despite everything, something in me moved. You were the most alive person in the room. I made a decision. To do what? To not be my father's instrument. That night, and afterward, and I stopped. Everything after that was real. The cottage was very quiet. Ellie made a small sound in sleep, that formless syllable that means nothing and everything. I know that isn't enough, I said. Nora looked at her hands. No, she said at last. It isn't. And then quieter. But it's something. 11:05 in the evening. 32 degrees. She asked me to leave, and I left. There was no version of this where I stayed, and I didn't ask, and I walked back to the inn along the coast road with the fog sitting on everything and the sound of the water somewhere to my left, invisible. I had handed her a match. What she did with it was hers. The inn was cold in the specific way of buildings asked to stay open past their willingness. The owner, a woman in her 70s with the permanently squinted expression of someone who had spent decades reading weather, had left a lamp on. I sat in the chair by the window and did not sleep and did not try to. What I turned over, through those hours, the 40 minutes in Rotterdam. How close I had come to being a different kind of man. Whether the choice I made that night was virtue or whether it was simply wanting, which can masquerade as virtue easily enough to fool even the person doing the wanting. At 2:48 in the morning, my phone lit up. Not Nora. a number I recognized with the low, specific dread of a smell that means something is burning in another room. My father's assistant. Message, not call, which meant it had been composed and was therefore worse than a call. Your presence has been noted in Heron Cove. Your father requests a conversation at your earliest convenience. He wishes you to know that he is aware of recent developments and considers them a family matter. I read it twice. Then I set the phone face down on the table and looked at the fog outside the window for a long time. He didn't know about Ellie. Recent developments meant he knew I had found Nora. Someone had seen me, or someone had been watching, which was its own distinct category of problem. The wall I had built between worlds had been the only protection she had, and I had walked through it myself by coming here, and now it wasn't a wall anymore. At 3:15 I was at her door. She answered in 30 seconds, had not been sleeping, took one look at my face and opened the door wider, which was not forgiveness and not welcome and was something more immediate than either. What happened, she said. My father knows I'm here. She processed that. One breath. Does he know about? I don't believe so. Not yet. I looked at her steadily. I'm not going to let that change. Her hand was still on the door. The cottage was dark behind her except for a small lamp in the kitchen, and Ellie was asleep down the hall, and outside the fog had gone absolutely still. Nora. I said her name the way I hadn't let myself say it yet. I need you to trust me for 48 hours. After that I'll have answers and you can make whatever decision you want with full information. But right now I need... Yes, she said. Quiet. Certain. No conditions. No negotiation. The word hit me somewhere undefended. 6:44 in the morning. 29 degrees. The first frost of the season had come in overnight, and the beach grass stood silver and still in the early light. The kind of morning that means something is ending, or changing, which, from the outside, can look the same. She had given me the couch. I'd spent the hours before dawn on a call I couldn't be overheard making, my father's assistant, then his lawyer, then a man in a gray area between those two worlds who owed me something from a decade past. By the time the light came, I had confirmation. The observer had been a private contractor, not a family man. He had a photograph of me, nothing more. Ellie's name appeared nowhere. I could contain it. I had. Nora came into the kitchen at 6:44 in gray wool socks and last night's composure. She looked at my face and read the news in it before I said a word. We're all right? I said. She let out a breath so slow and controlled it was almost nothing. Almost. Ellie woke 20 minutes later, announced her presence at full volume, and the cottage was briefly and completely transformed. Toast was made. Juice was administered. A disagreement was settled about which cup was the correct cup. I sat at the kitchen table and watched Nora conduct this small ordinary life she had built with both hands, entirely alone, and felt something I didn't have language for. Not regret, though that was present, something larger. The particular weight of understanding what a person is capable of, too late. After Ellie had been settled with a board book and a collection of small wooden animals she referred to collectively as her guys, Nora poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of me without asking, and sat across the table, and we were quiet in the way you can only be quiet with someone you've told the truth to. I owe you more than 48 hours, I said. You owe me nothing, she said. The accounting doesn't help. Then let me phrase it differently. I want to be here. In whatever form makes sense. I don't need it to look a particular way. I held her gaze, but I need it to be honest. She was quiet. The name I'll use going forward, I said, is Alexander. I'm done with the wall. I paused. It didn't protect either of us. She turned her coffee cup in a slow circle. Once. Twice. Her tell, when she was deciding something. She should know your name, she said at last. Her real one. I looked at the child across the room. Ellie had one wooden horse in each hand and was walking them across the windowsill with grave concentration, narrating something under her breath. Yes, I said. Outside, the frost had started to lift. The beach grass came back to itself. The fog, for the first time in days, had stayed off the water. Part 10, 3:41 in the afternoon. 38 degrees. The sun, low and pale in the November sky, had made it through for the first time since I arrived. I stood on the beach 100 meters from the cottage. Nora had said she needed an hour, which meant she needed more than that, and I was trying to give her room that was real and not merely performed. This had always been my failure, the difference between the space a man creates and the space a man genuinely allows. Ellie was asleep. The cove was still. I thought about my father. He would require attention, not now, but soon. There would be a conversation. I was no longer afraid of it the way I had been afraid of it at 29, at 35, at 40. Something about the last 18 hours had quietly moved the furniture around inside me, and what remained was a simpler architecture, one line clearly placed. This side, not that one. I heard her on the steps behind the dune before I saw her. She came to stand near me. Not beside me, a foot away, looking at the same water. We stood like that for a while. I used to love November, she said. Before everything, the way it strips everything back. And now, still. A pause. Under the rest of it, a wave came in, went out. Left the wet sand dark and exact. I'm not asking you to trust me, I said. I understand the distance I built. I understand I was the one who made honesty feel like risk. I watched the water. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to find out who we are now. Not then. Not what we were performing. I turned to look at her. Nora, who we actually are. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the light shifted, the sun moved an inch further toward the water, and a cormorant dropped from somewhere overhead and hit the surface clean. I don't know, she said. I don't know yet. I heard her on the steps behind the dune before I saw her. She came to stand near me. Not beside me, a foot away, looking at the same water. We stood like that for a while. I used to love November, she said. Before everything, the way it strips everything back. And now, still. A pause. Under the rest of it, a wave came in, went out. Left the wet sand dark and exact. I'm not asking you to trust me, I said. I understand the distance I built. I understand I was the one who made honesty feel like risk. I watched the water. What I'm asking is whether you're willing to find out who we are now. Not then. Not what we were performing. I turned to look at her. Nora, who we actually are. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the light shifted, the sun moved an inch further toward the water, and a cormorant dropped from somewhere overhead and hit the surface clean. I don't know, she said. I don't know yet. It was not a yes. It was not a door closing. She turned and walked back up the beach toward the cottage, toward the small lamp already lit in the kitchen window, toward the child asleep inside who had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn need to understand things. I stood there a moment longer, let the cold come off the water, let the light go. Then I followed her, not closing the distance, not stopping it from closing, just moving in the same direction, at a measured pace, like a man who has finally understood that some things cannot be managed, only shown up for, honestly, in the particular and insufficient light of what remains. The cottage door was open when I reached it. I went in.